The winter of 2019 descended on the Brooks Range with a brutality that reminded men why their ancestors feared the North. On the morning of January 15th, at precisely 0647 hours, Sergeant Daniel Kaufman of the Alaska National Guard stood at the summit of what the military cartographers had designated Summit Ridge Elevation, 1,247 feet, roughly 12 miles northeast of the Dalton Highway, and watched his breath crystallize in the air before gravity could pull it down. The thermometer mounted outside the command post registered negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit. By nightfall, the forecast promised it would drop another 6 degrees. Kaufman was from Fairbanks, a city where winter wasn't a season, but a character trait. He had enlisted in 2007, 3 months after his 19th birthday, telling his mother he wanted to serve his country. By January 2019, standing on a frozen ridge in the Brooks Range with ice forming in the stubble of his beard, he had served that country for 12 years and learned more about survival than warfare. But he understood cold. Cold was familiar. Cold was almost comforting in its predictability. Cold was home. The ridge itself rose from the surrounding terrain like a frozen wave, its western and northern slopes offering clear fields of fire across approaches that led to the supply routes the exercise planners had designated as critical objectives. There was nothing particularly strategic about Summit Ridge except its position. It overlooked valleys that connected to roads the defending forces needed to maintain. The attacking forces needed to seize those roads. Therefore, Summit Ridge mattered. 500 soldiers from the Alaska National Guard occupied defensive positions across those slopes. They had been there since January 12th, rotating duties, improving fortifications, and learning to function in temperatures that turned steel brittle and made simple tasks like loading a rifle magazine and exercise in patience and cold management. The men and women came from across Alaska, but a disproportionate number came from the interior and the North Slope. Fairbanks, Barrowkeets, Nome, places where 40 below wasn't unusual, where children learned young that winter demanded respect and preparation, or winter would teach those lessons with frostbite and death. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan, commanding officer of the Alaska Guard Battalion, had grown up in Nome, raised partly by his Inupiat grandfather after his father died in a fishing accident. He was 52 years old, gray at the temples, weathered like driftwood, and he understood something that would prove crucial in the coming hours. Winter wasn't just an environmental factor, it was terrain. It could be used, exploited, turned into an advantage if you knew how to read its moods and respect its power. On the afternoon of January 24th, with the sky the color of old iron and the wind beginning to pick up from the northwest, Brennan walked the defensive positions personally. He moved from bunker to bunker, foxhole to foxhole, checking each fighting position with the methodical care of a man who knew that small mistakes in extreme cold became fatal errors. He looked at how soldiers had arranged their gear. He checked their layering, making sure they wore wool against the skin, synthetic insulation, and the middle wind resistance on the outside. He made sure they had dry socks in sealed bags, that they knew to keep their water close to their bodies to prevent freezing, that they understood the difference between being cold and being hypothermic. At one position on the northwestern slope, he found Private First Class Thomas Chen stamping his feet and blowing on his hands despite wearing insulated gloves. Chen was 22 from Anchorage, 6 months into his guard service. His parents had immigrated from China in the 1990s, built a successful restaurant, sent their son to college. Chen had joined the Guard to help pay for his engineering degree at UAA. He looked worried. "How you doing, Chen?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying the tone of a man checking on someone's welfare rather than their military readiness. "Cold, sir," Chen admitted. "I grew up in Anchorage, but we had central heating. This is different." "This is what winter actually is when you can't walk inside and turn up the thermostat," Brennan said. He spent 10 minutes showing Chen how to create a heat reflection wall using his poncho and some paracord, how to position himself to use the wind shadow of the foxhole, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite before tissue damage became permanent. "Your ancestors survived winters colder than this without Gore-Tex or propane heaters," Brennan said. "The knowledge is in you. You just have to remember it." Further along the line, Brennan found Sergeant Patricia Kowalski checking the ammunition feed on her M240 machine gun. Kowalski was 38 from Juneau, a single mother of 3 who worked as a paralegal in civilian life and had served in the Guard for 16 years. She had the kind of competence that came from doing things correctly so many times that correct became automatic. "How's your sector, Sergeant?" Brennan asked. "Solid, sir," Kowalski said without looking up from her weapon. "Interlocking fields of fire with 2nd Squad. Pre-registered mortar coordinates. Ammunition stored in insulated containers to prevent condensation freeze. We're ready." "Kids doing okay?" Brennan asked, because he made it a point to know his people as people, not just as soldiers. "They think it's cool that Mom's out here playing war games," Kowalski said with a slight smile. "They don't understand why I can't just FaceTime them whenever I want. Tried to explain that we're simulating communications restrictions, but they're 9, 7, and 5. They just know Mom's not answering her phone." "When this is over, you take an extra day," Brennan said. "Go home. Be with them. This exercise matters, but they matter more." He moved on, checking positions, adjusting fields of fire, making small corrections that would mean the difference between effective defense and chaos when the pressure came. And the pressure was coming. Intelligence reports had been clear. The opposing force was large, well-equipped, and commanded by someone who had something to prove. Colonel Raymond Foster. The name sat in Brennan's mind like a stone in his boot. Foster was 48 career Army, currently commanding a composite force drawn from National Guard units across the southern United States. California, Texas, Florida, Arizona. 4,000 soldiers who had never experienced cold, like Alaska, offered equipped with the latest technology the military could provide for Arctic operations. Heated clothing systems, advanced night vision, GPS navigation, satellite communications, thermal imaging drones. Everything modern warfare could throw at an environmental challenge. Everything except experience. Brennan had known Foster 20 years ago when they were both captains stationed at Fort Richardson. They had been friends once, the kind of friendship forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. They had deployed together, trained together, trusted each other with their lives. Then Foster had taken credit for an operational plan Brennan had developed, presented it to the battalion commander as his own work, earned a commendation and a fast track to major, while Brennan stayed at captain for another 3 years. The friendship had ended the day Brennan confronted him, and Foster had said, "That's how it works, Marcus. Some of us are meant to lead, and some of us are meant to follow. You're a good soldier, but you'll never be more than that. You don't have the ambition." Brennan had requested a transfer the next day. He had left active duty a year later, returned to Alaska, joined the Guard, and built a life that meant something beyond rank and recognition. He had let go of the anger eventually, not through forgiveness, but through perspective. He had found his place. Foster apparently was still trying to find his. At 16:30 hours, as the weak winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon, Brennan received a radio call from the exercise control team. Colonel Foster wished to speak with him on a secure channel. Brennan climbed into the command bunker, a structure built into the hillside and reinforced with sandbags and timber, and picked up the encrypted radio handset. "Brennan," he said simply. "Marcus, it's been a long time." Foster's voice came through clear, despite the encryption, carrying a tone that suggested casual conversation rather than military communication. 20 years, Brennan said. "You're commanding the OPFOR for this exercise. I read the briefing." 4,000 of America's finest, Foster said, and Brennan could hear the smile in his voice. "Latest equipment, trained to the highest standards. Should be an interesting few days." "Weather's turning bad," Brennan said, looking at the meteorological report on the table in front of him. "Forecast shows temperatures dropping to -48 tonight. Wind chill below -70. You might want to recommend a delay until conditions moderate." "The equipment we have is rated to -60, Foster said. "Our heated clothing systems can maintain core temperature in conditions far worse than what you're describing. Technology has advanced considerably since you left active duty, Marcus. We're not the same military you remember." "Technology's a tool," Brennan said carefully. "But this cold is different than what your people are used to. Most of your soldiers come from warm climates. They won't have experience with the extreme cold management. Might be worth considering." "What I'm considering," Foster said, and now the friendly tone was gone, replaced by something harder, "is that you've been sitting up there in Alaska for 20 years, convincing yourself that local knowledge matters more than training and equipment. This exercise is going to demonstrate that modern military capability can overcome any environmental factor. Your people might know how to ice fish and run sled dogs, but my people know how to fight. We'll see which matters more. Brennan looked at the radio handset for a long moment before responding. You requested this exercise timing, but didn't you? You specifically asked for mid-January during the coldest period. I requested realistic conditions, Foster said. If we're going to train for Arctic warfare, we should train in actual Arctic conditions. Or are you suggesting we should only fight wars when the weather's nice? I'm suggesting that putting 4,000 soldiers who've never experienced this kind of cold into the field during the worst cold snap in 5 years is dangerous, Brennan said. This stopped being about training and became about something else, about proving a point, about settling something that should have been settled 20 years ago. The silence on the radio stretched for several seconds. When Foster spoke again, his voice was quiet but intense. Tomorrow night, Marcus, you're going to learn that the military has evolved beyond local knowledge and frontier skills. You're going to learn that technology and training beat experience. And maybe finally you'll understand why some people advance and others stay in pretty prima. The connection terminated. Brennan set down the handset and stood in the bunker thinking about pride and ambition and the ways they could corrupt judgment. Foster had turned a training exercise into a personal vendetta, and soldiers were going to suffer for it. At 18:23 hours with full darkness, settled over the ridge like a physical presence, and the temperature already down to -44 degrees. Brennan gathered his company commanders in the command bunker. 6 officers ranging in age from 26 to 44, all Alaska Guard and all with years of experience operating in extreme cold. He spread a topographic map on the table and looked at each of them in turn. They're coming, he said without preamble. Probably tonight, definitely tomorrow. 4,000 soldiers with excellent training and equipment they believe will protect them from the cold. They're commanded by someone who wants to prove that technology beats local knowledge, someone who's willing to put his people at risk to make that point. We've been monitoring their radio traffic, said Staff Sergeant Sarah Nakamura, the battalion's intelligence specialist. She was 26 from Kenai, her father a commercial fisherman, her mother a Japanese immigrant who had met him while he was stationed in Okinawa. Nakamura spoke Japanese and Russian fluently, had a degree in linguistics from University of Alaska Fairbanks, and had a mind that saw patterns others missed. She also had a secret that weighed on her. The Pentagon had asked her to evaluate the effectiveness of National Guard units operating in extreme environments. Her report would influence funding decisions, force structure, possibly the future of the Alaska Guard itself. She needed to be objective. She needed to be honest. But she also knew these people had trained with them, trusted them. Objectivity was harder when it affected people you cared about. What are you hearing? Brennan asked her. Confidence, Nakamura said. They're talking about this like it's a field exercise in moderate weather. Their leadership is emphasizing the capabilities of their cold weather gear. There's no discussion of cold weather injury prevention, no mention of rotating personnel to warming areas, no planning for equipment failure in extreme cold. They think their technology makes them invulnerable. Then they're going to learn a hard lesson, said Captain Michael Rodriguez, commander of Alpha Company. He was 32 from Wasilla and had spent summers working on the North Slope oil fields before joining the Guard. Question is whether they learn it before people get hurt or after. Our job is defense, Brennan said. We hold this ridge, we make them work for every meter, but we do it smart. We rotate people through warming positions every 30 minutes. We watch each other for signs of cold injury. We maintain our equipment, and we remember something important. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. Winter isn't our enemy. It's terrain. The other side sees it as an obstacle to overcome. We see it as an ally. That's the difference that's going to matter. Sir, Nakamura said carefully, if they take significant casualties from cold weather injuries during a training exercise, there will be an investigation. Colonel Foster's career will be over. He has to know that. Pride makes people stupid, Brennan said. Foster needs to prove he was right 20 years ago when he told me I'd never amount to anything because I lacked ambition. He needs to prove that his way, the conventional Army way, the technology and training way, is superior. That need is stronger than his judgment right now. So we prepare for them to come hard, come fast, and come unprepared for what this cold will do to them. He turned to the map, pointing to the approaches. They'll try to overwhelm us with numbers. Multiple simultaneous assaults from different directions. They have thermal drones, so our heat signatures are visible. We can't hide. But we can make every meter they advance cost them. Time equals exposure. Exposure equals cold injury. The longer we keep them out in this weather, the more their effectiveness degrades. We're not just fighting soldiers, we're using winter as a weapon. The meeting continued for another hour, refining defensive positions, confirming communication protocols, ensuring everyone understood that this had become more than an exercise. People could die tonight, not from bullets, which were simulation rounds, but from cold that didn't care about exercise rules or safety protocols. At 2,200 hours, the temperature had dropped to negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest gusted to 35 miles per hour, driving the wind chill down to negative 68. Metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin. Exposed flesh would develop frostbite in less than 5 minutes. Water froze in seconds. The kind of cold that penetrated every layer, every barrier, every defense, except knowledge and preparation. Sergeant Daniel Kaufman sat in his fighting position on the northern slope, methodically checking his sector through night vision optics that he had to periodically wipe clear of ice crystals. He had been on the line for 2 hours, but he had rotated through a warming bunker. Once already, spent 20 minutes next to a kerosene heater, drunk hot coffee, changed his socks, checked his extremities for numbness. He wore 7 layers. Silk long underwear against his skin, then merino wool, then synthetic fleece, then more wool, then his uniform, then an insulated jacket, then a wind-resistant parka. On his hands, he wore thin silk glove liners under heavier wool gloves that he could remove quickly if he needed finger dexterity. His face was covered with a balaclava and coated with petroleum jelly to prevent frostbite. He breathed through a scarf to warm the air before it reached his lungs. He had learned these techniques as a child. His father had been a trapper, running lines in the White Mountains northeast of Fairbanks, checking snares and traps in temperatures that regularly hit 50 below. Kaufman had gone with him, starting at age 8, learning to recognize the signs of hypothermia, learning to build emergency shelters, learning that winter would kill you if you didn't pay attention, but would leave you alone if you respected it and prepared properly. Those childhood lessons were keeping him alive now. More than that, they were keeping him effective. While soldiers from warmer climates would be struggling with numb fingers and clouded judgment from early-stage hypothermia, Kaufman would be functioning at full capacity. That was the advantage Brennan had talked about, not just surviving the cold, but using it. His thoughts turned to his daughter. Emma was 8 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and his stubborn chin. She had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 14 months ago. The doctors said the prognosis was good, that childhood leukemia had high survival rates with modern treatment, that she would probably be fine. Probably. The word haunted him. She was going through chemotherapy now, losing her hair, tired all the time, trying so hard to be brave. Before he had deployed to this exercise, he had visited her in the hospital. She had been lying in bed, too weak to sit up for long, but she had smiled when she saw him. "Daddy," she had said, "I'm being brave. You be brave too." "I will, baby girl," he had promised. "I'll be home soon." Promise. Promise, Wahish. He thought about that promise, now sitting in negative 45-degree darkness on a ridge in the Brooks Range, waiting for an attack that would come from soldiers who didn't understand what they were walking into. He thought about how badly he needed to keep that promise, how Emma needed him to come home, how he couldn't let anything, not cold, not combat, not anything, stop him from being there for her. At 23:30 hours, Private Chen positioned 40 meters to Kaufman's left, keyed his radio with 2 clicks. Contact, movement. Kaufman raised his night vision optics and scanned his sector. At first, he saw nothing but the green glow of amplified starlight on snow. Then he caught it. Shapes moving in the darkness, darker patches against the ambient glow. Many shapes, dozens, maybe hundreds. Chen's voice came through the radio, barely a whisper. "Alpha 2-6, this is Alpha 2-3. I have visual contact. Multiple personnel approaching from northwest. Range approximately 400 meters. Moving slowly. Large force." Kaufman keyed his own radio. "Alpha 2-6 confirms. I count at least 50 individuals in my sector. They're spread across a wide front." Across the defensive line, other observers reported similar contacts. The attack was coming from multiple directions, simultaneously attempting to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers and coordinated assault, exactly as Brennan had predicted. At 23:47 hours, Kaufman saw something that made his chest tighten. The approaching soldiers were struggling. Even through night vision, he could see it. They moved slowly, laboriously, fighting through snow that reached above their knees in places. They stopped frequently, and he could see them hunching against the wind. Some were helping others. They weren't moving like trained soldiers conducting a tactical assault. They were moving like people who were already in trouble. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. It was going to be a slaughter. Not from bullets, but from cold. The temperature had dropped to negative 47 degrees. Wind chill was approaching negative 72. The attacking force had been moving through that cold for over an hour, climbing slopes, carrying equipment, exerting themselves in conditions that would sap strength and core temperature with brutal efficiency. Their heated clothing might be rated for negative 60 in laboratory conditions, but out here with wind and exertion and the reality of extreme cold, rather than the theory of it, that technology was already failing. Kaufman could see it in how they moved. The jerky motions of people whose muscles were becoming stiff. The frequent stops of people who needed to rest but couldn't afford to. The clustering of people who were trying to share body heat. They were in trouble, and they hadn't even reached the defensive line yet. At midnight exactly, the clock in the command bunker marked the transition from January 25th to January 26, 2019. 4,000 soldiers from across the American South, equipped with the best technology the military could provide, began their assault on Summit Ridge. They came in waves, struggling through snow and darkness and cold that was already killing some of them, climbing toward defensive positions held by 500 Alaskans who had been born into winter and raised by it. The Alaskans held their fire. Company commanders had been explicit. Wait until they're close. Wait until you can't miss. Let them exhaust themselves on the approach. Let the cold do half your work for you. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan stood in the command bunker listening to reports flowing in from all sectors and thought about his old friend Foster and the lesson that was about to be taught. He thought about pride and technology and the ways that men convinced themselves they had conquered nature when nature could never be conquered, only respected. He thought about the soldiers struggling up that slope toward his lines. Good men and women following orders, unaware that their commander had sent them into conditions they couldn't handle because he needed to win an argument from 2 decades ago. He keyed his radio to all units. All stations, this is Alpha 6, they're coming. Hold your positions. Maintain fire discipline. Watch your people for cold injury. Remember, winter isn't our enemy tonight. Winter is our ally. It's already fighting this battle for us. We just need to not get in its way. Alpha 6 out. 50 meters down the slope, Sergeant Daniel Kaufman settled into his firing position, checked his weapon one final time, and waited. The shapes were closer now. 300 meters. 250. He could hear them, the labored breathing, the crunch of boots in snow, the occasional sharp command trying to keep formations together. 200 meters. 150. Close enough now to see individual soldiers through the night vision, their shapes bent forward against the slope, and wind weapons held awkwardly in gloved hands that were probably already going numb. 100 meters. Kaufman thought about Emma in her hospital bed being brave. He thought about promises made and promises that had to be kept. He thought about his father teaching him to survive winter in the White Mountains, lessons that had seemed so simple at the time, but had turned out to be the difference between life and death. 75 meters. The figures kept coming, kept struggling upward through cold that they couldn't understand because they had never experienced anything like it. Technology was supposed to protect them. Training was supposed to prepare them. But neither technology nor training could replace the knowledge that came from growing up in a place where winter was 6 months long and you learned to respect it, or you died. 50 meters. In the command bunker, Marcus Brennan listened to his company commanders reporting that all sectors were engaged, all positions were holding. The enemy was committed across the entire front. There would be no turning back now. The exercise had begun, but the real battle was between 4,000 soldiers and the brutal reality of an Arctic winter night. The winter that Alaskans knew. The winter that had forged them. The winter that was about to teach everyone watching what the ice sentinels of the North had always understood. You don't conquer winter. You learn from it. You respect it. You become its student. And tonight, Winter was going to teach a lesson that would be remembered for years to come. At precisely midnight on January 26, 2019, with the temperature at negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit and wind driving the chill factor down to negative 73, the first wave of Colonel Raymond Foster's assault force reached the base of Summit Ridge and began their final approach toward the Alaska National Guard defensive positions. Sergeant Daniel Kaufman watched them come. Through his night vision optics, the advancing soldiers appeared as luminous green figures, struggling through knee-deep snow, their movements already showing the mechanical stiffness of people whose bodies were beginning to shut down from cold. They were trying to maintain tactical formations, trying to use proper cover and movement techniques, but the environment was defeating them before they ever came into range. 40 meters to Kaufman's left, Private Thomas Chen had his radio headset pressed tight against his ear, monitoring the attacking force's communications. What he heard made his stomach clench. The voices coming through were stressed, some panicked. Men were reporting equipment failures, asking for permission to fall back to warming positions, requesting guidance when their GPS units stopped functioning. And over it all, one voice kept repeating the same message with increasing urgency. All units, this is Guardian 6. Maintain assault momentum. Push through equipment issues. The objective is within reach. Do not stop. I say again, do not stop. That was Foster. Chen had studied the opposing force structure during mission planning. Guardian 6 was the call sign for the overall commander. The man was ordering his people forward, despite clear indicators that they were in trouble. Chen keyed his squad radio. Sergeant Kaufman, you need to hear this. He switched the channel so Kaufman could monitor the enemy communications. For the next 2 minutes, Kaufman listened to the chaos unfolding across the attacking force's radio net. Units were scattered. Leaders couldn't find their soldiers. Electronic equipment was failing across the board. The heated clothing systems that were supposed to protect people in negative 60-degree conditions were shutting down because the batteries couldn't maintain charge in the real-world conditions of extreme cold high wind and physical exertion. Men were reporting numbness in fingers and toes. Some were simply going quiet, their radios transmitting nothing but the sound of harsh breathing. And Foster kept ordering them forward. That's insane, Chen whispered. He's killing his own people. Kaufman thought about Emma in her hospital bed, about promises made and the importance of getting home alive. He thought about the soldiers struggling up the slope toward his position, good men following orders from someone whose judgment had been corrupted by pride and the need to win. He thought about his father's lessons about winter, about respect, about understanding that some forces couldn't be defeated through determination alone. Range 50 meters, came the call from the company commander. Prepare to engage. Kaufman settled his weapon into his shoulder, controlling his breathing, keeping his trigger finger outside the guard until he had a clear target. The simulation rounds they were using would mark hits with paint, wouldn't cause serious injury unless fired at point-blank range. But the cold would cause serious injury. The cold was already causing serious injury. 40 meters. The lead elements of the assault were close enough now that Kaufman could see faces through his optics. Young faces, most of them. Kids from California and Texas and Florida who had joined the National Guard to serve their communities, to get education benefits, to be part of something larger than themselves. Kids who had never experienced cold like this because cold like this didn't exist where they came from. Kids who were paying the price for their commander's arrogance. Fire! The night erupted with the sharp crack of rifles and the heavier hammer of machine guns. Sergeant Patricia Kowalski's M240 opened up from Kaufman's right, pouring simulation rounds into the advancing force with the methodical precision of someone who had fired that weapon so many times that it had become an extension of her will. Across the defensive line, every position engaged simultaneously, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to the summit. The effect was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had climbed for nearly 2 hours through brutal cold found themselves suddenly under concentrated fire from positions they couldn't clearly see. The simulation rounds impacted with enough force to sting even through cold weather gear. Men fell tagged out by hits or simply dropped from exhaustion and hypothermia. Those who pressed forward discovered that the closer they got to the Alaska positions, the more withering the fire became. But Kaufman watched something else happening, something that disturbed him more than the tactical situation. Soldiers were falling and not getting up, not because they'd been hit, but because they physically couldn't rise. They would go down in the snow and just lie there, too cold, too exhausted, too hypothermic to continue. Some curled into fetal positions. Others simply sprawled face down and stopped moving. This wasn't combat anymore. This was environmental catastrophe happening in real time. Check fire, check fire. The command came through from Lieutenant Colonel Brennan. All units check fire. We have personnel down from cold exposure. Corpsmen forward. This is now a rescue operation. I say again, this is now a rescue operation. Kaufman safed his weapon and grabbed his aid bag, moving forward with Chen and 2 other soldiers from his squad. They found the first casualty 15 meters down the slope. A young soldier couldn't have been more than 20 from somewhere warm based on the way he was shaking. His eyes were unfocused. His lips were blue. His gloves were inadequate, thin synthetic things that might work for fall weather in Georgia, but were useless here. His fingers were white and waxy, frostbite severe stage. We got you, Kaufman said, wrapping the kid in an emergency blanket and signaling for a litter team. You're going to be okay. We're getting you warm. They moved down the slope, finding more casualties. Some had obvious simulation round hits. Most were simply incapacitated by cold. Chen, who had been terrified of this environment just hours ago, worked with focused intensity using the emergency cold weather protocols he'd learned from Brennan. Kaufman watched the young soldier from Anchorage transform from scared kid to competent medic, doing what needed to be done because people were dying. By 01:30 hours, the first assault wave had been completely repulsed. The casualty count was staggering. 217 soldiers tagged by simulation rounds. Another 103 down from cold-related injuries, many serious. The Alaska defensive line had taken 7 casualties, all from simulation rounds, none from cold exposure. In the command bunker, Brennan stood over the tactical map and tried to raise Foster on the command frequency. Guardian 6, this is Alpha 6. We need to suspend operations. We have multiple cold weather casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Repeat, we need immediate medical evacuation for cold casualties. The response when it came was cold in a different way than the air outside. Alpha 6, Guardian 6. The exercise continues. Second wave is preparing to assault. We will secure the objective. Ray, this isn't about the exercise anymore, Brennan said, abandoning radio protocol. Your people are getting frostbite. Some of them might lose fingers and toes. You need to pull them back, get them warm, reassess the situation. What I need, Foster's voice came back tight with anger, is for you to stop trying to tell me how to command my soldiers. We have a mission. We will complete it. Technology and training will prevail. Guardian 6 out. Staff Sergeant Sarah Nakamura, who had been monitoring both friendly and enemy communications, looked at Brennan with something close to horror on her face. Sir, I'm picking up conversations between his subordinate commanders. They're questioning his orders. Some are recommending immediate withdrawal. He's overruling all of them. Brennan made a decision. He keyed the radio to the exercise control frequency, connecting him to the senior observers overseeing the entire operation. Control, this is Alpha 6. I am formally requesting suspension of exercise operations due to environmental safety concerns. We have confirmed multiple serious cold weather injuries. Continuing operations under current conditions creates unacceptable risk to personnel. Request immediate halt and evacuation of cold casualties. There was a pause, then a new voice came through the radio. Alpha 6, Control 6, actual. We copy your concerns. However, Guardian 6 has command authority for the attacking force and has elected to continue operations. Unless you are withdrawing your force from the exercise, operations will proceed. It was a bureaucratic trap. Foster had command authority over his soldiers. The exercise controllers couldn't override his tactical decisions unless safety became critical enough to halt the entire operation. And Foster was gambling that his heated equipment would start working, that his soldiers would adapt, that sheer numbers would overwhelm the defense before the cold overwhelmed his people. Brennan looked at Nakamura. Are you recording all this? Every word, sir, she said quietly. She was thinking about the report she would have to write about how this conversation would end Foster's career, about how uncomfortable it was to watch someone self-destruct in real time. But she was also thinking about those soldiers lying in the snow with frostbitten fingers in hypothermic confusion, and she knew that her loyalty was to the truth, not to protecting someone who had stopped protecting his own people. At 02:15 hours, the second assault wave began their advance. This time, Foster had committed his reserve forces, fresh troops who hadn't yet been exposed to the killing cold for extended periods. The tactical theory was sound. Use rested soldiers to maintain pressure, overwhelm the defenses through sustained assault, achieve the objective through sheer determination. But the theory didn't account for the temperature dropping to negative 48 degrees. It didn't account for wind gusting to 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to negative 75. It didn't account for the fact that fresh troops were still troops from warm climates wearing equipment designed in laboratories, facing an environment that laboratory conditions couldn't replicate. The second wave came harder than the first. These soldiers moved with more determination, pushed forward with more aggression. Their commanders had told them the first wave had failed because they'd been too cautious, too slow. The second wave was ordered to be fast, vigilant, overwhelming. Kaufman, back in his fighting position after helping evacuate the first wave's casualties, watched them come and felt something close to despair. They were brave. They were determined. They were committed to their mission, and they were going to get destroyed not by the Alaska Guard, but by their own commander's refusal to accept reality. "Here they come," he said into his radio. "Same as before. They haven't learned anything." But then something unexpected happened. As the second wave reached the 50-meter mark and the Alaska positions prepared to open fire, a voice came through on the emergency frequency, the channel reserved for medical emergencies and urgent tactical updates. All Alaska stations, this is Guardian 2-4. I have critical information. Break." Brennan immediately responded. "Guardian 2-4, this is Alpha 6, send your traffic." "Sir, my name is Specialist Marcus Williams. I'm with the 143rd Infantry out of Houston, Texas. I transferred to Alaska 5 years ago, sir. I work on the North Slope. I joined the Alaska Guard 3 years back. I'm embedded with the attacking force for liaison purposes." Brennan felt ice form in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Foster had planted someone inside his command structure, or tried to. "Continue, Specialist." "Sir, Colonel Foster just contacted me on a private frequency. He asked me to provide intelligence on your defensive positions, specific locations of crew-served weapons, fields of fire, weak points in your line. He said I should remember where I'm from, originally remember my Texas roots, help my fellow Southerners complete the mission." The radio fell silent. Everyone in the command bunker waited. Nakamura had her hand over her mouth. The company commanders on the net were holding their breath. This was the moment where they would find out if Williams was warning them or if this was some elaborate deception. "Sir," Williams continued, and his voice was steady, certain. "I told him no. I told him I'm not from Texas anymore. I'm from Alaska. This is my home. These are my people. The Alaska Guard taught me things the Texas Guard never could taught me to respect this environment instead of trying to conquer it. So I'm here to tell you that I will not provide intelligence to the attacking force, and I'm here to warn you that Colonel Foster is not making rational decisions. His people are getting hurt. He doesn't care. He just wants to win. Somebody needs to stop this before people die." Williams out. Brennan stood in the bunker holding the radio handset, facing a decision that would define his career and possibly end it. He could accept Williams's warning at face value, trust a soldier he'd never met, believe that someone would choose loyalty to Alaska over loyalty to their original home. Or he could treat this as a deception, arrest Williams if he could find him, assume this was Foster's attempt to sow confusion. Trust or suspicion, faith or paranoia. He made his choice based on something he'd learned over 52 years of life, 20 of them in the Alaska Guard. Sometimes you had to trust your gut about people. Sometimes you had to believe that someone could change, could find a new home, could choose principles over convenience. "Williams," Brennan said into the radio, "thank you for your integrity. Return to your unit. Keep yourself safe. When this is over, come find me. We'll talk." Alpha 6 out. The second assault hit the defensive line at 0220 hours with twice the intensity of the first. The soldiers came fast, aggressive, determined. Kowalski's machine gun hammered out rounds in disciplined bursts. Kaufman fired controlled pairs, tagging attackers who got close enough to threaten the position. Chen, who had been terrified 12 hours ago, fought with the steady competence of someone who had found courage in crisis. The fighting was more intense this time. The attackers got closer, pushed harder, forced the defenders to give ground in some sectors. But the cold was still the dominant factor. Kaufman could see it in how the assault momentum degraded. The lead elements would push forward aggressively for 30 or 40 meters, then the advance would stall as soldiers simply ran out of physical capability. They would drop into the snow, gasping, shaking, unable to continue not because they lacked courage, but because their bodies were shutting down. At 0245 hours, a soldier reached Kaufman's position, stumbling over the defensive berm and collapsing into the foxhole. Kaufman spun weapon ready and found himself looking at a kid who couldn't have been more than 23 wearing a uniform marked with Texas National Guard insignia, his face gray with cold and exhaustion, his weapon dangling from nerveless fingers. The kid tried to raise his rifle, but his hands wouldn't respond. He tried to speak, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. He just stood there swaying, looking at Kaufman with eyes that were glazed with hypothermic confusion. Kaufman made a decision in half a second. He lowered his weapon, grabbed the kid by the equipment harness, and pulled him down into the relative shelter of the foxhole. "Chen, I need you here. I've got a cold casualty." Chen scrambled over, took one look at the Texas soldier, and immediately went to work. Emergency blanket, hand warmers, hot water from a thermos that Kaufman had been keeping inside his parka against his body to prevent freezing. They worked on the kid like he was one of their own, because in that moment he was. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another soldier who had been sent into conditions he couldn't handle by someone who should have known better. "What's your name, son?" Kaufman asked, keeping his voice calm, reassuring. Rodriguez," the kid managed through chattering teeth. "Jesse Rodriguez. Miami. I'm from Miami. It's never cold in Miami. Never. I didn't know. I didn't know it could be like this." "You're going to be okay, Jesse," Kaufman said, wrapping more insulation around him. "We've got you. You're safe now." "They said the suits would work," Rodriguez said, and he was starting to cry, which concerned Kaufman because crying meant wasted moisture and heat. "They said they were rated for 60 below. They said we'd be fine. But my suit stopped working an hour ago. The battery died. And then I was just cold. So cold. My fingers stopped working. I couldn't hold my rifle. I couldn't feel my feet. I just kept walking because they told us to keep walking." "Who told you?" Kaufman asked, though he already knew. "Colonel Foster. He kept saying, push through, maintain momentum, technology will protect us." But it didn't. It didn't protect us at all. Chen looked at Kaufman, and in that look was a question they both knew the answer to. This wasn't training anymore. This had become something darker. This had become a commander sacrificing his people's welfare to satisfy his own need to be right. Across the defensive line, similar scenes were playing out. Attacking soldiers reaching the Alaska positions not in triumph but in desperation, looking for warmth, for safety, for relief from cold that was killing them incrementally. The Alaska Guard soldiers who an hour ago had been preparing to defend against these same people were now pulling them into foxholes and bunkers, wrapping them in blankets, sharing hot coffee and hand warmers and body heat. At 0320 hours, with the temperature at negative 49 degrees and wind chill approaching, negative 77 staff, Sergeant Nakamura intercepted a radio conversation that made her blood run cold despite the layers of insulation she wore. It was a conversation between Foster and one of his battalion commanders, a lieutenant colonel from the California Guard. "Sir, I have 18 confirmed cases of severe frostbite in my battalion. I have 57 soldiers showing signs of hypothermia. My corpsmen are telling me we need immediate evacuation. I am formally requesting permission to withdraw my battalion from the assault." Foster's response was immediate and harsh. "Request denied. We are within reach of the objective. One more push and we break through. Rally your people and resume the attack." "Sir, my people can barely walk. Their equipment has failed. We are taking more casualties from environmental exposure than from enemy fire. I cannot in good conscience order them forward in these conditions." "Then I will find someone who can. You are relieved of command. Transfer authority to your XO and report to my headquarters. All units, this is Guardian 6. Maintain assault pressure. We do not quit. We do not surrender to weather conditions. We complete the mission." Nakamura immediately relayed this to Brennan. "Sir, he just relieved a battalion commander for trying to protect his soldiers. This has gone beyond training. This is criminal." Brennan grabbed the radio. "Control, this is Alpha 6. I am hearing reports of a battalion commander being relieved for recommending withdrawal due to safety concerns. I need immediate command intervention. Soldiers are being endangered by poor leadership decisions. The response came from Control 6, and it was careful, bureaucratic, maddeningly neutral. Alpha 6 personnel decisions within the attacking force command structure are not subject to exercise control intervention. If you have specific evidence of safety violations, submit a formal report through the after-action review process. Bureaucracy, procedures, channels. While soldiers develop frostbite that would cost them fingers and toes, Brennan made his second career-defining decision of the night. He keyed the radio to all Alaska frequencies. All Alaska stations, this is Alpha 6. New rules of engagement. Any attacking force personnel showing signs of cold weather injury will be given immediate assistance regardless of their tactical status. We are suspending defensive operations and shifting to humanitarian assistance. I don't care if this violates exercise protocols. I will not watch people get permanent injuries while we follow rules. And all company commanders acknowledge. One by one, the acknowledgments came through. The Alaska Guard had just unilaterally ended their participation in the exercise in order to save the people who were supposed to be their opponents. At 0347 hours after receiving reports of 8 soldiers with stage 4 frostbite, requiring possible amputation and over 50 with dangerous hypothermia, Colonel Raymond Foster finally gave the order to withdraw. His voice on the radio was flat empty of the confidence and arrogance that had characterized it hours before. All Guardian units, this is Guardian 6, withdraw to assembly areas. Exercise operations are concluded. Begin casualty evacuation procedures. But withdrawing was almost as dangerous as attacking had been. Soldiers who had been barely functioning during the assault found themselves unable to navigate back through the darkness and cold. Units became separated. Individuals wandered off course. The cold, which had been brutal during the advance, became lethal during the retreat. At 0410 hours, Nakamura picked up a desperate radio transmission. Any station, this is Guardian 4-2. I have 30 personnel separated from the main body. We are lost. GPS is not functioning. We cannot determine direction. We need immediate assistance. Temperatures are critical. Personnel are collapsing. Please advise. Brennan didn't hesitate. Guardian 4-2. This is Alpha 6. Transmit your last known position. We are launching search and rescue. Help us coming. It took precious minutes to get coordinates to plot a probable location to organize a rescue team. Every minute was time those 30 soldiers spent dying in the darkness. I need volunteers for search and rescue, Brennan called on the command net. This is dangerous. Visibility is near zero. Temperature is life-threatening. But there are 30 people out there who will die without help. Kaufman's voice came back immediately. Alpha 2-6 volunteers, give me a grid and we're moving. Alpha 3-1 volunteers, that was Kowalski. Alpha 2-3 volunteers. Chen's voice steady despite his earlier fear. Within 5 minutes, Brennan had 50 volunteers more than he needed. He selected the most experienced cold weather operators, issued them emergency equipment, and briefed them on the mission. These are fellow soldiers who got into trouble following bad orders. We get them home alive. Move out. Kaufman led one of the search teams navigating through darkness using terrain association and dead reckoning, the old skills his father had taught him long before GPS existed. They moved carefully but quickly, knowing that every minute counted. Behind him, Chen and 2 others followed in his footsteps, trusting his judgment, his knowledge of how to move through this environment. They found the first group of lost soldiers at 0435 hours, huddled together in a shallow depression, trying to share body heat. There were 12 of them, all in bad shape. Kaufman's team immediately began emergency cold weather treatment. Williams, the Texas soldier who had chosen Alaska, led the effort to build an emergency snow shelter using techniques he'd learned during Alaska Guard training. We're getting you out of here, Kaufman told them. Stay together, stay moving. We'll guide you back. They found another group at 0448 hours. 8 soldiers, 2 unconscious, the rest barely responsive. More blankets, more heat packs, more desperate work to raise core temperatures enough for movement. The third group was in the worst shape. 10 soldiers scattered across a 100-meter area, some sitting in the snow, unable to move, others wandering in circles, their minds clouded by hypothermia. One soldier had removed his parka because severe hypothermia creates a paradoxical sensation of heat, and confused victims often undress, which accelerates death. Kaufman and his team worked with focused intensity, gathering the scattered soldiers, getting insulation on them, forcing them to drink warm liquids, checking extremities for frostbite. Williams found one soldier who wasn't breathing. He immediately started CPR compressions and rescue breathing in negative 50-degree cold, refusing to quit even when it seemed hopeless. After 3 minutes, the soldier gasped and started breathing again. Williams sat back in the snow exhausted, and Kaufman put a hand on his shoulder. Good work, soldier. That's how Alaska does it. By 0500 hours, as gray dawn light began to filter through the darkness, the rescue teams had located all of the separated units. 28 of the 30 soldiers were alive, suffering from various degrees of cold injury, but alive. 2 had died before the rescue teams reached them, victims of severe hypothermia, their bodies found curled in the snow. Kaufman stood on the ridge as the sun broke the horizon, watching the medevac helicopters arrive to transport the most seriously injured. He thought about Emma, about going home, about promises kept. He had survived, but 2 young soldiers hadn't. 2 families would receive notifications. 2 sets of parents would bury their children because someone had been too proud to admit when conditions exceeded capability. In the warming tent that served as a casualty collection point, Colonel Raymond Foster sat alone, staring at the casualty report. 673 total casualties from his force. 2 dead, 89 with severe frostbite requiring immediate hospitalization. 582 with hypothermia and lesser cold injuries, all from a training exercise. All because he had needed to prove he was right. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan found him there an hour later. Foster looked up, and in his eyes was something Brennan had never seen before. Defeat. Not tactical defeat, but the soul-deep defeat of a man who had discovered that he had become something he never intended to be. You were right, Marcus, Foster said quietly. 20 years ago you were right. And tonight you were right again. Technology didn't overcome the environment. Training didn't overcome local knowledge. And pride, he paused, his voice breaking slightly. Pride cost 2 young soldiers their lives. Brennan sat down across from him, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch. I'm done, Foster said. My career is over. I'll be lucky if I don't face criminal charges. But that's not what keeps me up. What keeps me up is knowing that I sent those kids into conditions they couldn't handle because I needed to win an argument with you. Because I needed to prove that I was right about everything. How do I live with that, Marcus? How do I look at myself knowing I killed 2 of my own soldiers through arrogance? Brennan thought about the question for a long time before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried no triumph, no vindication, only the tired wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons through experience. You live with it by learning from it, by making sure their deaths mean something, by teaching others not to make the same mistakes. You don't get to run from this ray. You have to carry it. And maybe if you carry it right, you save lives down the road. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Summit Ridge, illuminating a battlefield where the only enemy had been pride and the only victims had been people who deserved better from their leaders. The Alaska Guard had proven what they had always known, that winter wasn't something to be conquered, but something to be understood. And in warming tents across the assembly area, soldiers from Texas and California and Florida sat wrapped in blankets provided by Alaska Guard soldiers who had stopped being their opponents and become their rescuers, learning a lesson about environments and humility and the difference between being tough and being prepared. The exercise was over, but the lessons had just begun. The sun rose over Summit Ridge on the morning of January 26, 2019, revealing a landscape transformed not by battle, but by the brutal mathematics of environmental exposure. Medical evacuation helicopters circled the area like metal dragonflies, their rotors beating against air so cold that exhaust vapor hung in frozen clouds. Below them, soldiers in various states of cold injury waited for transport, wrapped in emergency blankets that made them look like refugees from some distant catastrophe rather than participants in a military training field exercise. The final casualty count arrived at Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan's command post at 0723 hours. He read the numbers with a heaviness that had nothing to do with fatigue. 2 dead, both from severe hypothermia. 89 with frostbite serious enough to require immediate hospitalization and possible amputation. 57 with moderate hypothermia requiring medical observation, 525 with minor cold weather injuries, frostbite and exposure, 673 total casualties from an attacking force of 4,000. The Alaska National Guard forces had taken 12 casualties, all from simulation round impacts during the fighting. Not a single case of serious cold weather injury. Not one soldier evacuated for frostbite. Not one incident of hypothermia beyond the mild numbness that came from extended exposure with proper preparation. The numbers told a story that no amount of after-action analysis could obscure. Local knowledge had defeated technology. Experience had overcome training. Respect for the environment had proven more valuable than the most advanced cold weather gear the military could provide. At 08:15 hours, a Black Hawk helicopter touched down near the command bunker, carrying 3 officers from United States Army Alaska Headquarters in Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. They were not exercise observers, they were investigators. Colonel Foster's decision to continue operations despite clear evidence of environmental danger, his relief of a subordinate commander who had recommended withdrawal for safety reasons, and the resulting deaths had triggered an immediate inquiry into potential dereliction of duty and reckless endangerment. Staff Sergeant Sarah Nakamura watched the investigators arrive and felt the weight of what she carried. For the past 12 hours, she had recorded everything, every radio transmission, every order given, every warning ignored. She had documentation that would end Foster's career and possibly result in criminal charges. She had evidence that would validate the Alaska Guard's capabilities and likely result in increased funding and recognition. Her report would matter. Her honesty would have consequences. She thought about the easy path. She could soften the criticism of Foster. She could present the disaster as a series of unfortunate circumstances rather than the result of one man's arrogance. She could protect careers and reputations while still accomplishing her primary mission of evaluating Alaska Guard effectiveness. Then she thought about the 2 families who would be planning funerals. She thought about the soldiers who would lose fingers and toes to frostbite because someone had prioritized winning over safety. She thought about young soldiers like Rodriguez, the kid from Miami, who had stumbled into Sergeant Kaufman's foxhole crying because his equipment had failed, and no one had prepared him for what real cold felt like. Rodriguez had survived, but others hadn't been so fortunate. She made her choice the way she made all her important choices, by asking herself what kind of person she wanted to be when she looked in the mirror. At 0940 hours, she submitted her preliminary report to the investigating team. It was detailed, precise, and devastating. She documented Foster's refusal to delay operations despite weather warnings. She included recordings of his dismissal of safety concerns. She provided timeline analysis showing that casualties increased directly in proportion to the duration of exposure Foster mandated. She made no recommendations about punishment or consequences. She simply presented facts and let those facts speak for themselves. One of the investigators, a lieutenant colonel with 30 years of service and the weathered face of someone who had seen too many preventable disasters, read through her report and then looked at her with something like respect. "This took courage, Sergeant. A lot of people would have found ways to make this less damaging." "With respect, sir," Nakamura said quietly, 2 soldiers are dead. 89 more might lose parts of their bodies. The truth isn't damaging. What happened was damaging. I'm just reporting it." By noon, the medevac operations were complete. The most seriously injured had been transported to hospitals in Fairbanks and Anchorage. The remainder of Foster's force was being moved to heated facilities for observation and recovery. The Alaska Guard soldiers had been released from duty, sent back to warming areas for rest and post-operation debriefing. Sergeant Daniel Kaufman sat in a warming tent drinking coffee that actually tasted hot for the first time in 18 hours and called his daughter. The call went through to the hospital room in Fairbanks, where Emma was undergoing treatment. His ex-wife answered, and there was relief in her voice that told him she had been worried, despite knowing this was just a training exercise. "She's been asking about you every hour," his ex-wife said. "Hold on." Then Emma's voice came through, small and tired, but with that core of stubborn strength that reminded him so much of himself. "Daddy, are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby girl," Kaufman said, and his voice broke slightly despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "I'm safe, I'm warm, I'm coming home soon." "Did you be brave?" Emma asked, and he could hear the echo of their last conversation when she had promised to be brave through her treatment if he promised to be brave in the field. I tried to be, he said, but you know what I learned? Being brave doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means helping people, even people who are supposed to be on the other side. We helped a lot of people last night who needed help. Because that's what good people do, Emma said, and he could hear her mother's teaching in those words the lessons about compassion and humanity that transcended whatever tactical situations he found himself in. That's exactly right, Kaufman said. I'll be home tomorrow. We'll have pancakes. Deal. With chocolate chips. With chocolate chips, he promised. And when he ended the call, he sat for a long moment thinking about promises kept and the ways that his daughter's courage in facing her illness made his own challenges seem smaller by comparison. On January 27th at 1400 hours, Colonel Raymond Foster requested a private meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan. They met in a small office at the Operations Center, just the two of them, no staff, no witnesses, no official record. Foster looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were hollow, his uniform was rumpled. His hands shook slightly when he poured coffee from a thermos. I owe you an apology, Foster said without preamble. Not just for this exercise, for everything, for taking credit for your work 20 years ago, for telling you that you lacked ambition when what you really lacked was my willingness to step on people to get ahead, for spending 2 decades believing I had been right when I was wrong about everything that mattered. Brennan sat across from him and said nothing, letting Foster work through whatever he needed to work through. I requested this exercise timing specifically, Foster continued. I looked at historical weather data. I knew this was the coldest period. I wanted conditions that would test both of us. But really, I just wanted to prove that you were wrong for leaving, wrong for choosing Alaska over career advancement, wrong for being satisfied with being a lieutenant colonel in the Guard when you could have been something more. Something more, Brennan repeated quietly. What's more than being home? What's more than serving with people you respect in a place you love? What's more than knowing who you are and being at peace with it? Foster's face crumpled. I don't know, Marcus. I thought I knew. I thought rank mattered, recognition mattered. Proving I was the smartest guy in the room mattered. And I was so focused on proving all that I sent people into conditions they couldn't handle. I ignored warnings. I dismissed concerns. I relieved a good officer for trying to protect his soldiers. And 2 kids died because I needed to win an argument with you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 20 years of history and 1 night of catastrophe. The investigators are going to recommend charges, Foster said. Dereliction of duty, reckless endangerment, maybe criminally negligent homicide. My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. And you know what the worst part is? I deserve it. I deserve all of it. Those 2 soldiers, Walker and Martinez, they deserve better. Their families deserve better. Every soldier under my command deserved better than a commander who cared more about being right than keeping them safe. Brennan studied his old friend, seeing not the arrogant officer who had stolen credit, or the prideful commander who had ignored safety, but the broken man who had finally understood the cost of his choices. There was no satisfaction in this moment, no sense of vindication, just sadness for waste and tragedy and lessons learned too late. What are you going to do? Brennan asked. Face the consequences, Foster said. Take whatever punishment comes. But after that, if they let me, I want to teach. I want to make sure other commanders don't make my mistakes. I want those 2 deaths to mean something more than just another cautionary tale in a leadership manual. Brennan considered this for a long moment. Then he made a decision that surprised even himself. When this is over, when you've faced whatever the investigation brings, come back here. The Army is going to create an Arctic Warfare Training Center. They've been talking about it for years, and this disaster is going to force them to actually do it. Help build that center. Teach officers what you learn. Not the tactical lessons, the human ones. Teach them about humility, about listening to local knowledge, about understanding that being a leader means protecting your people, even when it costs you the mission. Foster looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. Why would you want me anywhere near something like that? Because the best teachers are the ones who learn through failure, Brennan said. Because those 2 soldiers deserve to have their deaths prevent future deaths. And because 20 years ago you were my friend before you became my rival. Maybe we can get back to that. Not the friendship we had, but something new, something built on honesty instead of competition. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was the beginning of something. Recognition that people could change, that mistakes could become lessons, that even the hardest experiences could be transformed into something with meaning. Over the following weeks, the full scope of the disaster became clear through investigations and medical reports. Of the 89 soldiers with serious frostbite, 47 would require partial amputations. Fingers, toes, parts of ears, and noses lost to cold that could have been avoided with proper planning and respect for environmental conditions. Lives permanently changed because technology had been trusted more than experience. The Alaska National Guard received official commendation for their humanitarian response during the exercise. Their decision to suspend tactical operations in favor of rescue efforts was cited as an example of proper priorities and leadership under crisis conditions. Funding for Guard operations in Alaska was increased. Equipment allocations were enhanced. Most importantly, the decision was made to establish the first dedicated Arctic Warfare Training Center in the United States to be built in Alaska and staffed primarily by soldiers with extensive cold weather experience. Private First Class Thomas Chen, who had started the exercise, terrified of the cold, became one of the training center's first instructor candidates. His transformation from scared recruit to competent cold weather operator made him valuable for teaching others who came from warm climates. He understood their fear because he had lived it. He could show them the path from terror to confidence because he had walked it himself. I grew up in Anchorage with central heating and a car with heated seats, he told his first class of trainees 6 months later. I thought I knew cold because I'd experienced Alaska winters. I didn't know anything. Real cold, the kind that kills you, that's different. But here's what I learned. It's not your enemy if you respect it. It becomes part of your tactical advantage if you understand it. My ancestors survived worse than this without any of our technology. That knowledge is in all of us. We just have to remember it. Sergeant Patricia Kowalski received the Army Commendation Medal for her actions during the exercise, specifically for maintaining fire discipline and sector security, while simultaneously coordinating medical assistance for injured attackers. She used the small amount of award money to take her 3 children on a winter camping trip, teaching them basic cold weather survival skills. "Why do we need to know this, Mom?" her 9-year-old son asked while she showed him how to build an emergency shelter from snow. "Because knowledge is what keeps you alive when conditions get hard," she said. "Because understanding your environment means you never have to be afraid of it. And because someday you might need to help someone who doesn't know what you know, and that person's life might depend on whether you paid attention today." Specialist Marcus Williams formally transferred from the Texas National Guard to the Alaska National Guard and requested permanent assignment to the Arctic Warfare Training Center. When asked why he wanted to stay in Alaska rather than return to Texas, he gave an answer that became part of the training center's unofficial motto. "Texas made me a soldier. Alaska made me someone who understands that being a soldier means more than following orders and shooting straight. It means knowing your environment well enough to protect your people from it. It means understanding that the strongest soldier isn't the one with the best equipment, but the one with the most knowledge. I'm not from Texas anymore. I'm from here. This is home." Colonel Raymond Foster was not charged criminally. The investigation determined that while his decisions were severely flawed and demonstrated poor judgment, they did not rise to the level of criminal negligence under military law. He was, however, relieved of command, reduced in rank to lieutenant colonel, and ordered to retire from military service. In his final official report before retirement, Foster wrote a document that became required reading at the Command and General Staff College. In it, he detailed every mistake he made, every warning he ignored, every moment when pride had overruled judgment. He ended with a paragraph that was quoted in leadership classes for years afterward. "I believed that technology could overcome environment, that training could replace experience, that determination could defeat nature. I was wrong about all of it. The soldiers who died under my command died because I valued being right more than being wise. I valued victory more than safety. I valued my ego more than my duty. Let my failure be a lesson. Nature does not care about your rank, your technology, or your pride. It will kill you if you don't respect it. And if you're in command, it will kill the people who trusted you to lead them well." True to his word, Foster returned to Alaska 18 months later after completing his transition to civilian life. He was hired as a consultant for the Arctic Warfare Training Center, not in a leadership role, but as someone who taught the cautionary lessons. He told his story over and over, never softening it, never excusing his choices, always emphasizing the human cost of his arrogance. On a cold morning in March, he stood in front of a class of new officers and told them about Summit Ridge, about the temperature dropping to -49, about the soldiers who lost fingers and toes, about Private James Walker and Specialist Daniel Martinez, who never made it home. Some of you are thinking that you would never make the mistakes I made, he told them. You're probably right, but every one of you will face moments when your ego wants one thing and your duty demands another. When proving you're right feels more important than doing what's right. In those moments, remember what happened on Summit Ridge. Remember that 2 families buried their sons because I couldn't admit I was wrong. Don't be me. Be better than me. After the class, a young lieutenant approached him. Sir, I'm from Arizona. I've never experienced real cold. This assignment scares me. How do I overcome that fear? You don't overcome it, Foster said. You use it. Fear keeps you alert. Fear makes you prepare. Fear makes you listen to people who know more than you do. The soldiers who got hurt on Summit Ridge weren't afraid enough. Their commander wasn't afraid at all. Be afraid. Let it make you humble. Let it make you careful. Let it make you someone who respects what you don't fully understand. By the spring of 2020, the Arctic Warfare Training Center had trained over 2,000 soldiers in proper cold weather operations. The curriculum was built on lessons learned from the Summit Ridge disaster. Technology was taught as a tool, not a solution. Local knowledge was valued as tactical intelligence. Respect for environment was treated as a combat multiplier. And every class began with the story of what happened when pride replaced judgment, when arrogance defeated wisdom, when a commander forgot that taking care of his people was more important than completing the mission. Sergeant Daniel Kaufman was promoted to staff sergeant and assigned as a primary instructor at the center. He taught advanced cold weather survival drawing on lessons his father had taught him decades earlier in the White Mountains. He showed soldiers how to read weather signs, how to recognize the early stages of hypothermia, how to build emergency shelters, how to maintain equipment in extreme cold. But more than the technical skills, he taught philosophy. He taught that winter wasn't an enemy, but a teacher. That harsh environments didn't weaken people who understood them. They forged those people into something stronger. That the goal wasn't to conquer nature, but to learn from it, to move with it, to become its student rather than its opponent. His daughter Emma went into remission in December of 2020. The leukemia that had threatened her life responded well to treatment, and by her 10th birthday, her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. Kaufman took leave to be with her during her recovery, and on the first day, she was strong enough for a short walk outside. They stood together in the snow behind their house in Fairbanks. It's cold, Daddy, she said, though she was bundled in layers that made her look twice her actual size. It is cold, he agreed, but you're handling it fine. You know why? Because I'm dressed right. Because you're prepared, he said. Because you know how to be comfortable in uncomfortable conditions. Because you learn that being tough isn't about ignoring discomfort, it's about managing it. That's what you did with your treatment. You didn't pretend it wasn't hard. You prepared yourself, you managed the difficulty, and you came through it. Like you did on Summit Ridge, she asked. She knew the story. He had told her a version appropriate for a 10-year-old focusing on helping people rather than combat. Exactly like that, he said. Life is going to give you hard conditions sometimes. Winter weather, serious illness, difficult challenges. The way you handle them is by preparing, by learning, by respecting what you're facing, instead of pretending you're tougher than it. That's real strength. She thought about this for a moment, then said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. So the ice didn't make you strong. Learning from the ice made you strong. That's exactly right, baby girl, he said. That's exactly right. 5 years after the Summit Ridge exercise in January of 2024, Kaufman returned to the site with his daughter, now 13, and healthy considering whether to join the Alaska National Guard when she turned 18. They stood at the summit where he had fought that night, looking down at the slopes where desperate soldiers had struggled through killing cold. The temperature that morning was -38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to crystallize breath, cold enough to demand respect. But Kaufman didn't shiver. He stood comfortably in layers taught by his father, refined through experience, proven through trial. Emma stood beside him, dressed properly, warm enough, learning through experience rather than lecture. "This is where it happened," she asked. "This is where it happened," he confirmed. "Where 4,000 soldiers learned that technology can't replace knowledge. Where 2 soldiers died because someone valued pride over safety. Where a lot of people learned lessons about humility and environment and the difference between being equipped and being prepared." "Do they still teach about it?" Emma asked. "Every day," Kaufman said, "at the training center down below. Right now there are soldiers learning the same lessons. Learning to respect cold instead of trying to conquer it. Learning that the harshest environments teach the most important skills. Learning that strength comes from understanding, not from domination." Below them, visible through the clear, sure Arctic air, the Arctic Warfare Training Center hosted its 90-second training cycle. Soldiers from across America, most from warm climates, learning what Alaskans had always known. Learning to read weather patterns. Learning to recognize early-stage hypothermia. Learning to maintain equipment in extreme conditions. Learning that nature was not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher to be respected. The center had trained over 8,000 soldiers in 5 years. It had become the premier cold weather warfare facility in the United States military. Officers came from allied nations to learn Arctic operations. Specialists came to understand environmental factors and tactical planning. Leaders came to hear Foster's cautionary tale and Brennan's philosophy of environmental respect. And every graduation ceremony ended the same way. The senior instructor, usually Brennan himself, would read the names of Private James Walker and Specialist Daniel Martinez, the 2 soldiers who died on Summit Ridge. Their names were engraved on a memorial at the center entrance. Their sacrifice was remembered not as heroic combat deaths, but as preventable tragedies that had forced the military to confront uncomfortable truths about pride technology and the limits of human capability against natural forces. "We remember them," Brennan would tell each graduating class, "not to assign blame or relive tragedy, but to ensure their deaths accomplish something. You have spent weeks learning technical skills. You have learned to operate in extreme cold. You have learned to maintain equipment, manage cold weather injuries, plan operations around environmental factors. But the most important thing you have learned is humility. You have learned that knowledge matters more than technology. That experience matters more than training. That respecting what you don't fully understand is wiser than believing you can overcome anything through determination." Staff Sergeant Sarah Nakamura had been promoted twice since Summit Ridge. She was now at the Pentagon working in doctrine development for extreme environment operations. Her report from that night had become the foundation for new policies across the military regarding environmental safety and training exercises. Commanders now had explicit guidance about when to delay or cancel operations due to weather. Safety officers had authority to override tactical decisions when environmental risk became too great. Medical personnel had enhanced training in cold weather injuries. But more than policy changes, her report had validated something important. It had demonstrated that the Alaska National Guard, often dismissed as a backwater assignment for officers without ambition, possessed expertise that the conventional military needed. It had shown that local knowledge was a strategic asset, not a quaint anachronism. It had proven that sometimes the best soldiers were not the ones with the most advanced equipment, but the ones who understood their environment so thoroughly that they had become part of it. On the 5th anniversary of Summit Ridge, January 26, 2024, a ceremony was held at the Arctic Warfare Training Center. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan, now preparing for his actual retirement after 32 years of service, stood before an assembly that included military leadership, Alaska political figures, and many of the soldiers who had participated in that exercise. Raymond Foster was there, no longer in uniform, but wearing the civilian consultant credentials that marked his current role. Williams was there now, a sergeant first class and senior instructor. Chen was there, having just received orders to attend officer candidate school. Kowalski was there with her 3 children, all of whom were now talking about military service themselves. Nakamura had flown in from Washington. And Kaufman stood with Emma, letting her see the place where her father had learned and taught important lessons about strength and survival. Brennan's speech was brief, as befitted a man who had never been comfortable with ceremony or attention. 5 years ago, something happened on this ridge that changed how the United States military thinks about environment training and the limits of technology. We lost two good soldiers. We learned hard lessons. We were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about pride and judgment and the ways that arrogance can cost lives. He paused, looking at the assembled soldiers, seeing the mix of veterans who had been there and new recruits who knew the story only as history. But something else happened here too. We learned that the harshest environments don't weaken the people who understand them. They forge those people into something stronger. We learned that local knowledge is not primitive or outdated. It is refined wisdom earned through generations of experience. We learned that respecting nature is not weakness. It is tactical intelligence. And we learned that sometimes the best way to win is to stop trying to conquer and start trying to understand. He gestured to the training center behind him. This facility exists because of what happened here. 8,000 soldiers have learned from our mistakes and our successes. They have learned to operate in conditions that would have been impossible for previous generations. Not because they have better technology, though they do, but because they have been taught humility. They have been taught respect. They have been taught that winter is not their enemy, it is terrain to be understood and used. The ceremony concluded with the reading of Walker's and Martinez's names, followed by a moment of silence. Then the assembly dispersed, soldiers returning to training, visitors returning to their lives, the business of preparing, warriors continuing as it always had. Kaufman and Emma walked back down the ridge together, following the same path he had taken 5 years before during the rescue operations. Emma was quiet, thinking about what she had seen and heard. "Daddy," she finally said, "those two soldiers who died, do you think about them all the time?" Kaufman said honestly. "I think about how they followed orders from someone who should have known better. I think about how they trusted their equipment when they should have trusted caution. I think about how their families lost sons because pride mattered more than safety." "Is that why you teach now?" Emma asked. "So it doesn't happen again." "That's exactly why," he said. "So their deaths mean something. So other soldiers learn the lessons they paid for. So other families don't have to bury children because someone made the same mistakes." They reached the bottom of the ridge and stopped at the memorial stone that bore Walker's and Martinez's names. Kaufman stood there for a moment, as he did every time he passed it, remembering. Then he put his hand on Emma's shoulder. "You asked me once if the ice made me strong," he said. "The ice didn't make me strong. Learning from the ice made me strong. Learning to respect it. Learning to work with it instead of against it. Learning that sometimes the most powerful force is the one that teaches you humility." Emma looked up at the ridge, at the place where history had happened, where lessons had been learned through tragedy and triumph. "When I'm old enough," she said, "I want to join the Guard. I want to learn what you know. I want to be like you." "Then I'll teach you," Kaufman promised. "Not just about surviving cold, about understanding environment, about respecting what's more powerful than you, about protecting people who need protecting, about being strong enough to choose helping over winning. That's what the Ice Sentinels really are. Not warriors who conquered winter, guardians who learned from it." The sun climbed higher over Summit Ridge, illuminating the training center, where another generation of soldiers learned ancient lessons through modern methods. The temperature was -38 and the wind was sharp, but inside warming bunkers, soldiers rotated through to maintain effectiveness. On the slopes, instructors taught proper layering, cold weather injury recognition, environmental respect. In classrooms, officers learned about humility and judgment and the fatal consequences of valuing pride over safety. The lessons of Summit Ridge had been written in ice and blood and tragedy, but they had also been written in survival and adaptation and wisdom earned through experience. The Ice Sentinels of Alaska had proven something that military leadership had needed to learn: that the harshest environments produce not the most brutal soldiers, but the most capable ones. Not despite the hardship, but because of it. Not because cold made them tough, but because respecting cold made them wise. Not because they conquered winter, but because they learned from it. And in that learning, in that respect, in that ancient knowledge passed down through generations and proven again on a frozen ridge in January, they had become something that no amount of technology or training could replicate. They had become students of an environment that would kill the arrogant and spare the humble. They had become guardians who understood that true strength came not from dominating nature, but from partnering with it. The Ice Sentinels, forever watching, forever teaching, forever remembering the night when winter fought alongside them and taught everyone watching the difference between being equipped and being prepared, between technology and wisdom, between conquest and respect. The lessons written in ice, taught in frost, proven in the brutal crucible of an Arctic winter night, would endure as long as soldiers needed to understand that the most dangerous enemy was not the one across the battlefield, but the one they failed to respect, the environment itself, indifferent to pride, unmoved by technology, teaching its lessons with absolute certainty to anyone willing to learn. And on Summit Ridge, where it had all happened, the wind continued to blow, the cold continued to teach, and the ice continued to forge sentinels from those wise enough to become its students rather than its victims.